the same degree, where touch and connect is somewhat differently described and defined. So I would therefore hold a view that processes and methods in which we manage and the way we work and the way we promote development ought to be seen from a little more Indian idiom point of view. And we are very rich in it.
Right.
So for example, coaching is something that I think has been part of our, what I would call our parampara.
Right.
We have always listened to our parents, in a sense.
Right.
We have always respected those not necessarily for their brains, but for their age.
Right.
Right? So things like this are very idiomatic of an Eastern civilization, which is not so in a Western civilization.
Right.
So there are relative strengths which could be leveraged in terms of the human process and the human development and the leadership competencies that you talk about. So that's the long winding point I wanted to make on a simple difference.
Yeah, I think some great points there, and I think especially if you look at that Indianness aspect, and who are really some of the icon we have in that space is Dronacharya, for instance. I mean, he's probably the biggest coach that we've heard about. And then if you look at Lord Krishna, and he was a mentor to Arjuna. And so some of that, if that's what is there in our heritage, then probably those things will work very well with us as against 360, though our research says 90% of top companies in Asia use 360, so probably even that is a good.
What do they do with it is another.
Right. So great points, and so of course, Richard, yes.
One thing that I was going to add, the example that you're talking of Dronacharya or coaching, very much inherent in Indian culture. I think a lot of informal mentoring that happens in the organization may not be very true of the Western world.
Right.
Their mentoring would be a very formal program, whereas in India, many of the organizations, they may not have launched a formal mentoring program, but still there is mentoring that has been happening. Like the example that you had shared, where someone just walked up to Pratik and asking him to guide him as to what his experiences has been from moving to a different route. I think that was just an informal mentoring example.
Yeah. So, I think that's a great point. And one of the, I'll share with you an experience I had when I was conducting this top company for leaders survey in Japan. My Japan office, after great resistance, last time agreed to get some of the participants from Japan, because my point was some of the largest corporations that we see in the world are Japanese. So how is it that they don't have great processes for creating leaders? So we had, our way of doing the survey, and we, let those companies do some of the biggest names in Japanese, industry. And from the parameters that we had, they didn't qualify to go and do audit. So I went back to colleagues in Japan to say, you know what, there's something wrong. There is some interpretation wrong. How is it possible that no Japanese company is passing that, filter of at least having a finalist interview? And the Japanese colleagues were so reticent. They said, no, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. We are not going to go back to companies and tell them, now give us verbal confirmations and what's done is done. But my point is, what works in Japan is great mentoring culture again. There, one leader hands over the baton to the other over games of golf. So they are moving around, shadowing, and what we call as shadow mentoring, right? And they are doing a great job of that. And so probably, again to the point, what is culturally right for us probably is what we should be doing, because then there will be path of least resistance. So I come to you, Savita, on that note to ask you, what do you think are the competencies that global leader needs over and above or different from what any other good leader would need?
If I were to, and I was just writing these down when your presentation was on, going by what I've seen in the IT industry, many a time, we really keep talking about think global, act local, right? We all have been hearing this around us. So I think thinking globally is one of the very key competencies. And when I say thinking globally, we are not just talking about preaching and talking very high and 20,000 feet altitude and all of that, but somebody who understands what necessities, my company, for example, works in 16 countries. So when I say thinking globally, I'm talking about any rollout. We have this principle called one stereo. So when we say one stereo, we're talking about anything that we do in a country should be implemented across the globe of stereo. Now that doesn't actually work. So a leader would actually have to think very pragmatically and see, what does this mean? If you're looking at the same example that I used earlier, the performance appraisal system or the management system, if you look up the European countries, they don't quite believe in the PM systems. And they all have these unions. They don't quite like it if they're not graded very well on the bell curve. So they don't understand what the bell curve is all about. If you look up, we did experiment it in Germany and in Sweden and all of those places, Spain too, but it didn't work, misfired. And we had a huge problem with the unions taking over there. So, when we're looking at thinking globally, to me it's about implementing anything that you want and being sensitive to the global needs of your employees, your workforce. Then I jotted down something called appreciating cultural diversity. I'm sure we've been talking about embracing diversity. So diversity is about, how do I carry the entire workforce, given that needs of each geography are different. So when I come out with something, be it a policy or principle or a guideline, it has to differ in different geographies. So we need to keep that and be sensitive to diversities. We also need a global leader to demonstrate technological savviness. Now, we're not expecting a global leader to be a big programmer or an ace technician himself. However, he would need to understand how to leverage technology, how to think way ahead for the organization, and how to carry along with him a workforce, because today you're dealing with an extremely intelligent workforce. I'm sure many a time, we have implemented this very successfully. We've come out with what is called the innovation box. So we've had people down the line come up with their innovative thoughts. There are contests which we organize once in 6 months. And they're very, radical questions that we put, very bold answers that we receive. And we've got, people coming back to us with feedback and saying, thank you so much for implementing the suggestion. Some of them definitely require the organization to plunge and take the risk, but it does work. So, demonstrating tech savviness is extremely important for a leader. He shouldn't just be talking about technology, but it's about how you leverage technology to bring in the change in the organization, how your systems and practices can address current challenges around you. Building partnerships is another key competency. So when you say building partnerships, I'm talking about, today you're dealing with customers, your partners, your vendors, and you deal with organizations where you have all three of them in one organization. Within an organization, you may have somebody as your customer, somebody as your vendor, somebody as your supplier. So how do you carry this set of people along with you? How do you actually build very effective partnerships to ensure your objectives of the organization are met? Is yet another very important competency. The fifth competency that I think is very important is sharing leadership. So when we say sharing leadership, we do have a set of leaders in the organization who are leaders of the past. We have a set of leaders whom we are trying to build in the organization. We call them future leaders. And we have a set of leaders who are in the pipeline, being built, who are being groomed, where a lot of money, a lot of investment is on. We have assessment centers in progress, we have evaluations being conducted, accreditations being made, internal, external, so on and so forth. So when we talk about these three different generation of leaders in one workplace, it's important as to how you share your leadership vision, your mission, and how are you able to actually put it down to the brass tacks? How do you ensure the future leader understands what the leader of the past is trying to say? Because the leader of the past is all, in my opinion, gone. We're talking about nurturing leaders within the organization, creating leaders in the future. So it's very important to share leadership. And when I say share leadership, it's not just about talking and practicing the mission statement. It's about understanding what is it that will be the norm tomorrow. What is the new norm? And how do I get this new leader, the future leader, to concur or carry the new norm?
Great points. Dr. Richa, what would you say over and above what we heard from Savita are some key important competencies for global leaders?
Yeah.
Covered most of the points. I would just be able to add one or two maximum. I would talk about one competency which we have in our organization, which is called as optimism. For us, it is a distinguishing competency for a leader. And when this integration had happened, when Putney was acquired by iGate, at that stage, we did not have, erstwhile Putney did not have this competency, and we were not able to relate what is the importance. Now, having studied that in detail, having experienced what it means and the kind of results that it produces, I think that's a very relevant competency for a leader. In current times of uncertainty, having the optimism, giving that optimism to people in the organization, having that high aspirations that we will be able to make it. There is a bright future. I think that's a very distinguishing competency that I would say that a leader should have.
Right. And so I have this question to the entire panel, because you mentioned the fact that we are going through some rough times, and the organizations then that who faced with a situation where some tough decisions need to be taken. Now, in that context, how would a global leader operate, and what are the competencies he or she will bring to fore? Sure.
Okay. You want it?
No,
Okay.
I'm happy with the initiative.
First of all, I'll add on to the earlier question because I thought I had something to share in terms of the competency or capabilities that makes you global. I did talk about diversity. Apart from that, the second most important thing according to me, which a global leader should have, is comfort with not only uncertainty but complexity and ambiguity. This is a skill I think which is increasingly required if you want to be global, because if at all, as we know, world is getting more complex, more uncertain, more ambiguous, and if we can live with it without getting flustered, without getting frustrated. And in that sense, given the fact that our country is so chaotic, many of us are well qualified. Because a train can come 1 hour late, we may be standing at the station, and even after 1 hour we will be saying that it must be coming, there must be some reason. The Western world, they go nuts. The train comes 5 minutes late. Their ability to put up with this kind of thing is very limited. And the fact that we are blessed with a country which is so chaotic, and no wonder that so many Indians are making to the top in many global competitions, because we can live with it. And that I think is a great asset. And that is something which I suspect that many of these global leaders should have. Of course, coupled with that, your ability to be decisive and risky during uncertainty. Because one of the things that we see happening around, and what makes the current set of uncertainty more worrying is, it has led to a certain amount of paralysis. Not only in the Indian context, but globally, both with the government as well as with the business. Though there have been uncertain times in the past, in the recent past, in the last 20-30 years, it has never led to this amount of paralysis that we see. And one of the things I would think that a global leader should have, if he or she wants to be successful, be decisive and take that risk, even in uncertain times.
Right.
And these are some of the things that I would think a global leader should have.
Right.
Now, there was a second question that you...
Yeah, what I said was these are tough times, some tough decisions need to be taken. What competency then a global leader brings to fore to face such a situation?
Okay, in a sense, maybe the last part of my answer talked about it. That this ability that when you are having 60-70% of the answers, you jump in, because you will never ever going to get 100% inputs in terms of what you want to do.
Right.
Those kind of paradigms are gone.
Right.
And increasingly it is getting
Right.
lesser and lesser. So if you have this ability to jump in with 60-70% confidence
Right.
in terms of the facts, numbers, analysis that you can have,
Right.
and in the process end up taking a risk, of course.
Yeah.
Lesser is the information, more is a risk that you take. But if you can do that, and if you can do that better than competition does,
Right.
then you are in game. And I would think that that will be called for to take things ahead for our organization.
Right.
This whole ability to stick one neck out and then say that though the information is not 100% complete,
Right.
I'm going to use my horse sense
Right.
and jump in.
Right. So if I read you correct, what you're saying is take that risk, follow the conviction, and be decisive, and then follow through. And if you do that, then you will be able to overcome. I then come to the last question, and I would request each one of you to share one instance in that, so that then we have time for questions from the audience. Now that question is, we talked about what a global leader is, what is a global mindset, what are the competencies of a global leader. Now next question that I have is, can you share one gem, one little gem, one way that you think these global leaders can be created? In your experience, you've seen that work. So, one good practice of creating a global leader. And Richa, would you like to share?
Creating global leaders is something that we have to start early. It is not only that we start grooming people 2 years from now. In our organization, the way it happens is the grooming of leadership would start from a project manager level person, which would actually mean something like about 10 years of experience upwards. And we would see that how can we actually bring him on a fast track within the next 3 years' time. There are fast track program structure, there is a mentoring program, there are stretch goals given to those people, job rotations given to them so that they have exposure in different areas. And the mechanism, the performance review mechanisms that happens for them is also separate. It is different from the rest of the organization. And the true focus is how are we creating leaders 3 years from now.
Great, thank you. Professor Srinath.
The best way to actually develop a cadre of people is to push them into the pool.
Okay.
Give them a challenging opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Force them to jump in.
Yeah.
Let them get that experience, whether they're successful or unsuccessful.
Right.
Followed up by mentoring and coaching. Because I always believe that mentoring and coaching has to have some context.
Right.
And if the context can be provided, where people will really stretch,
Right.
take the plunge,
Right.
and try to get things done.
Right.
And then go through that experience, whether it is, as I mentioned, successful or unsuccessful, doesn't matter.
Right.
And then bring them back and look at in terms of what kind of mentoring coaching that they need to do. This would be one approach that I would recommend in order to produce a cadre of people.
So take people out of comfort zone.
Exactly.
Okay, great. So Sharada, would you like to share that one trait?
No, what we are actually doing is what Professor Sriram said, which is, giving people different learning experiences. But prior to that, one learning that we have had, and we have learned it through mistakes that we have made, is to have a fairly robust system of identifying the right talent.
Right.
And I think once that is done, we probably have crossed 30% of the ocean or the river or whatever.
So,
And then putting them through different experiences, the chances of being successful in developing these people, I would say, is pretty high.
and what would you think, or what in your experience is very important to identify the right people? How can you do that?
We actually have a system that you talked about best practices.
Right.
We have for many years followed a system of identifying potential.
Right.
And we keep varying the competencies of what is what is the DNA of a leader. In fact, I would think that what we had 5 years ago and what we have carved out now, for example, I didn't answer the earlier question. Personally, I think in my experience, there is really no difference, major difference in the competencies of a leader for a, in a particular organization versus a global leader. I think it's just the emphasis and the texture that can change depending upon the situation and the context and the culture at that point in time.
Right.
So what we have done is we have altered these competencies every now and then. We have reviewed them to see how meaningful they are. And in our mind now, what we call as integration, which is what you call as connecting the dots, and adaptability, flexibility, because it's so uncertain that I can't even say last year I did this, so I need to do it this year. We start afresh and look at it. So I think these would be the two things that would be important. So our system takes care of this.
And the measurement mechanism would be what of those competencies?
See, finally we say that the proof is in your performance.
Okay.
So if we do give you an opportunity, based on your potential, you have to show results.
Right. Okay.
So it can't be academic.
Great. Thank you, Sridhar.
I'll start with a confession. I'm a Capricornian, so therefore, which is a few months away. So I'm used to a contrarian view. So I don't think, first of all, there are global leaders and local leaders. Okay, there are leaders, period. Right? Because if even you look at India, then how is it any different from the world? Right? There is a Gujarat which claims an 18% growth in GDP. And there is a Kerala which is perhaps sliding back at about 5-6%. So there are parts, India itself is a microcosm of the world.
Right.
Leaving aside the language and so on.
Right.
So I think to me, it is all about developing leaders.
Right.
And if you develop good leaders, they will perform well, subject to certain things like the language and so on and so forth.
Right.
So I very much tend to agree with what both Sriram and Shabda have said, which is, I think leadership can't be taught in a classroom.
Right.
It is not developed there. I think you need to get real opportunities in the real world. You will tumble, you will make a few mistakes, but it doesn't matter. I think what is important is to be